Loaded. Mine's going to take a sec. There we go. So, as we start to read this, I'm going to read out loud. You can follow along. Today we're reading chapter 1, so if you would prefer to read it on your own without hearing me read it, by all means, feel free to do so. I will kind of pause occasionally throughout the chapter to discuss things. So if you benefit from that discussion, then you could always fast forward to where I start discussing, however you would like to do it. But we will begin chapter 1. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jim got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed, and Jim's fears of never being able to play football were assuaged, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. His left arm was somewhat shorter than his right. When he stood or walked, the back of his hand was at right angles to his body, his thumb parallel to his thigh. He couldn't have cared less, so long as he could pass and punt. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discussed the events leading to his accident. I maintained that the Yules started it all, but Jim, who was 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. He said it began the summer Dill came to us, when Dill first gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. I said, if you wanted to take a broad view of the thing, it really began with Andrew Jackson. If General Jackson hadn't run the creeks up the creek, Simon Finch would never have paddled up the Alabama, and where would we be if he hadn't? We were far too old to settle an argument with a fistfight, so we consulted Atticus. Our father said we were both right. Being Southerners, it was a source of shame to some members of the family that we had no recorded ancestors on either side of the Battle of Hastings. All we had was Simon Finch, a fur-trapping apothecary from Cornwall, whose piety was exceeded only by his stinginess. In England, Simon was irritated by the persecution of those who called themselves Methodists at the hands of their more liberal brethren, and as Simon called himself a Methodist, he worked his way across the Atlantic to Philadelphia, thence to Jamaica, thence to Mobile, and up the St. Stephen's. Mindful of John Wesley's strictures on the use of many words in buying and selling, Simon made a pile practicing medicine, but in this pursuit he was unhappy, lest he be tempted into doing what he knew was not for the glory of God, as the putting on of gold and costly apparel. So Simon, having forgotten his teacher's dictum on the possession of human chattels, bought 3 slaves, and with their aid established a homestead on the banks of the Alabama River, some 40 miles above St. Stephen's. He returned to St. Stephen's only once, to find a wife, and with her established a line that ran high to daughters. Simon lived to an impressive age and died rich. It was customary for the men in the family to remain on Simon's homestead, Finch's Landing, and make their living from cotton. The place was self-sufficient, modest in comparison with the empires around it. The landing nevertheless produced everything required to sustain life except ice, wheat flour, and articles of clothing supplied by riverboats from Mobile. Simon would have regarded with impotent fury the disturbance between the North and the South, as it left his descendants stripped of everything but their land. Yet the tradition of living on the land remained unbroken until well into the 20th century, when my father, Atticus Finch, went to Montgomery to read law, and his younger brother went to Boston to study medicine. Their sister Alexandra was the Finch who remained at the Landing. She married a taciturn man who spent most of his time lying in a hammock by the river, wondering if his trot lines were full. When my father was admitted to the bar, he returned to Macomb and began his practice. Macomb, some 20 miles east of Finch's Landing, was the county seat of Macomb County. Atticus's office in the courthouse contained little more than a hat rack, a spittoon, checkerboard, and an unsullied code of Alabama. His first 2 clients were the last 2 persons hanged in the Macomb County Jail. Atticus had urged them to accept the state's generosity in allowing them to plead guilty to second-degree murder and escape with their lives. But they were Haverfords, in Macomb County, a name synonymous with jackass. The Haverfords had dispatched Macomb's leading blacksmith in a misunderstanding arising from the alleged wrongful detention of a mare, were imprudent enough to do it in the presence of 3 witnesses, and insisted that the son of a bitch had it coming to him was a good enough defense for anybody. They persisted in pleading not guilty to first-degree murder, so there was nothing much Atticus could do for his clients except be present at their departure, an occasion that was probably the beginning of my father's profound distaste for the practice of criminal law. During his first 5 years in Macomb, Atticus practiced economy more than anything. For several years thereafter, he invested his earnings in his brother's education. John Hale Finch was 10 years younger than my father, and chose to study medicine at a time when cotton was not worth growing. But after getting Uncle Jack started, Atticus derived a reasonable income from the law. He liked Macomb. He was Macomb County born and bred. He knew his people, they knew him, and because of Simon Finch's industry, Atticus was related by blood or marriage to nearly every family in the town. All right, so pausing at that little page break there for a second, let's kind of cover what we know so far. So in order to discuss the important characters arising in this section, I'm going to be flipping back and forth between the book and the graphic organizer. So if you want to go ahead and get that out, I'm going to talk about a lot of characters today. I've highlighted them so I don't forget any of them. So, people who have been mentioned so far. Atticus Finch has been mentioned quite a lot. Dill was dropped in there once already. Jim Finch has been mentioned as well. Let's see if there's anybody else. Uncle Jack Finch was name dropped once in there. So there's been a few people who have already been established as major characters. Now, the thing I want to ask you is, which one of these characters is telling us the story? So in the very first line of the story, it says, when he was nearly 13, my brother Jim got his arm badly broken at the elbow. So me, whoever our first person narrator is, it must be the sister of Jim. So if we look on our graphic organizer, Jean Louise Finch, also known as Scout, is the younger sister of Jeremy Atticus Finch, Jim. So when we think about Scout, who obviously is going to be an important character, I want you to remember that she is our narrator. And we're going to try and define all of these other characters with how they connect to her, since she is our primary, most important character. All right, so far, we don't know too much about Scout. She's been telling us about some other people. We do know a few things about Jim. For one thing, we know that he is Scout's older brother. Okay, so he's the older brother to Scout. A couple other things were mentioned about him. Mentioned that he broke his arm in that incident that has not yet been described. Also mentioned that he loved football. When he broke his arm, he was so worried that he might not be able to play football. So those things I'm putting under direct characterization because they are directly revealed to us. I can look at that page and I can just highlight, the information. Broke arm badly broken, same thing. And football, there's the football there. Okay, so that's some direct information that we have about Jim. Let's see. Another thing that was mentioned about Jim is that Jim is 4 years my senior. So that means he's 4 years older than Scout. So we can add that to his information. 4 years older than Scout. Okay, so we got a little bit of information about Jim here. All right, let's see what else we got. Now, this middle bit about Simon Finch. Simon Finch is an ancestor of the Finch family. If you were paying attention to his little biography here, he died even before the Civil War, so he was an ancestor from a long time ago. So this section, which I don't find terribly interesting about Simon Finch, isn't something that you necessarily need to commit to heart. So, carrying on. All right, my father. So we know that Atticus Finch is Scout and Jim's father and admitted to the bar. We know that he is a lawyer. So the question is, what kind of lawyer? Now, it mentions that he practices criminal law. So these are people who are accused of crimes. He's not a real estate attorney or a tax lawyer or anything like that. These are serious crimes. And from the incident involving the Haverfords, we can tell that he was defending them or attempting to. Didn't seem like they were terribly smart about their situation. So, Atticus Finch, we know that he is a lawyer, and specifically we know that he is a criminal defense lawyer. So he defends criminals. That is his job. We also get some other information about him. It does mention that after the incident with the Haverfords, let's see. Okay, so his first two clients were the last two persons hanged in the Macomb County Jail. Now, obviously, we probably can't blame Atticus for these idiots who, this was their defense that they tried to argue, and that's not a very good defense. So, since nobody else has been hanged since then, we can probably pretty safely assume that Atticus is a pretty good lawyer, and that assuming people take his advice, he's probably doing a pretty good job. And actually, apologies, I need to put that in indirect characterization because they don't tell us he's a good lawyer. We're just kind of assuming that from the description about him. So, and we need to add that he is Scout's father. Okay. All right. There was something else I wanted to say about Atticus. Let's see, where is he? Okay, so this last little paragraph that we read here, John Hale Finch. So he's 10 years younger than Atticus. He's his younger brother. And Atticus invested his earnings in his brother's education. So once he became a lawyer, he wasn't just focused on his own profit, he was focused on helping his family. So we could probably say that Atticus is a good brother, or you could say he's loyal or generous. Some people have said that. I'll add that. I like that word, generous. So, seems like a pretty decent guy so far. Okay, so that's what we have at the moment. So let's carry on. Now, the next thing I'm going to read, these next two paragraphs, are a description of our town, Macomb, Alabama. So as I read through these, I just want you to kind of ask yourself, would I want to go here on vacation? Macomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks. The courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow, it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, and after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with, nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macomb County. But it was a time of vague optimism for some of the people. Macomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. So once again, we have that little allusion there to FDR, nothing to fear but fear itself. Now, the town, typically, 99% of the time, if I ask people if they would like to vacation there, they say, heck no. So this town is not terribly appealing. It's kind of gross and muddy, and it's hot and sweaty. And since it's the Great Depression, there's not a whole lot of money and not much to buy, even if you'd had any money. Things are slow. They're boring. So, Macomb County is not the most exciting of places, which of course begs the question, how did Harper Lee manage to write an entire book about it? Something must happen. So, in this boring, slow, hot kind of town, we lived on the main residential street in town. Atticus, Jem, and I, plus Calpurnia, our cook. Jem and I found our father satisfactory. He played with us, read to us, and treated us with courteous detachment. Calpurnia was something else again. She was all angles and bones. She was nearsighted. She squinted. Her hand was wide as a bed slat and twice as hard. She was always ordering me out of the kitchen, asking me why I couldn't behave as well as Jem when she knew he was older, and calling me home when I wasn't ready to come. Our battles were epic and one-sided. Calpurnia always won, mainly because Atticus always took her side. She had been with us ever since Jem was born, and I had felt her tyrannical presence as long as I could remember. Our mother died when I was 2, so I never felt her absence. She was a Graham from Montgomery. Atticus met her when he was first elected to the state legislature. He was middle-aged then. She was 15 years his junior. Jim was the product of their first year of marriage. 4 years later, I was born, and 2 years later, our mother died from a sudden heart attack. They said it ran in her family. I did not miss her, but I think Jim did. He remembered her clearly, and sometimes, in the middle of a game, he would sigh at length, then go off and play by himself behind the car house. When he was like that, I knew better than to bother him. When I was almost 6 and Jim was nearly 10, our summertime boundaries, within calling distance of Calpurnia, were Mrs. Henry Lafayette de Beauce's house 2 doors to the north of us, and the Radley place 3 doors to the south. We were never tempted to break them. The Radley place was inhabited by an unknown entity, the mere description of whom was enough to make us behave for days on end. Mrs. de Beauce was plain hell. That was the summer that Dill came to us. All right, so some more character information I want to get down before we move on to Dill, who is a very entertaining character. We've got some information about Calpurnia here. Now, Calpurnia is not biologically related to anyone in the family, but she helps out with the family. Why? Well, because family has suffered a little tragedy. So when Scout was only 2 years old, her mom died. So we have Calpurnia helping out with the family. Scout and Calpurnia don't always seem to get along very well. So let's get down some information for Calpurnia. Now, Scout describes Calpurnia. She's below Charles Baker Harris. She says that she is the cook for the family. So we'll put that as her relationship to the characters for now. She also says that Calpurnia is all angles and bones. She's probably a skinny old thing. Says she squinted, maybe has a little trouble seeing. And let's see what else. Her hand was wide as a bed slat and twice as hard. So actually, I'm going to put that in this box. So we can assume that if Scout knows exactly how hard her hand is, then Calpurnia is pretty strict and doesn't mind letting Scout know who's boss. But we also get the sense, especially from the way that Atticus respects Calpurnia and always takes her side, that Calpurnia, in the absence of their real mother, kind of serves as a mother figure to the children and has been instrumental in helping to take care of them during their young lives. So that's some information about Calpurnia. Let's see, what else do we have? I guess that's about it so far. Okay, so, oh, no, there was one more thing. Ages. So when this story starts, Scout is almost 6 and Jim is nearly 10. So if you're almost 6, well, then you're 5. And if you're nearly 10, then you're 9. Now, the interesting thing about that is that, let's see, go back up to the top. The first line of our story told us when he was nearly 13, my brother Jim got his arm badly broken at the elbow. They haven't told us how he broke it yet. But obviously, if we're starting when Jim is only 9 years old, this book takes place over about 4 years. So, just something to keep in mind. We're going to put down Jim and Scout's starting ages, how old they are at this point, but just realize that they are going to age throughout the book. So right now, at the beginning of the book, so at the start of the book, Scout is 5 years old. And Jim, who is of course 4 years older than Scout, at the start of the book, he's 9 years old. So that's how old they are at the beginning. Okay, now, Dill. So Dill is going to be an important character. So let's observe their first meeting, the first summer that Dill came to Macomb. Early one morning, as we were beginning our day's play in the backyard, Jim and I heard something next door in Miss Rachel Haverford's collard patch. We went to the wire fence to see if there was a puppy. Miss Rachel's rat terrier was expecting. Instead, we found someone sitting, looking at us. Sitting down, he wasn't much higher than the collards. We stared at him until he spoke. Hey! Hey yourself, said Jim pleasantly. I'm Charles Baker Harris, he said. I can read. So what? I said. I just thought you'd like to know I can read. You got anything needs reading, I can do it. How old are you? Asked Jim. 4.5? Going on 7. Shoot, no wonder then, said Jim, jerking his thumb at me. Scout yonder's been reading ever since she was born, and she ain't even started to school yet. You look right puny for going on 7. I'm little, but I'm old, he said. Jim brushed his hair back to get a better look. Why don't you come over, Charles Baker Harris? He said. Lord, what a name. It's not any funnier than yours. Aunt Rachel says your name's Jeremy Atticus Finch. Jim scowled. Well, I'm big enough to fit mine, he said. Your name's longer than you are, but it's a foot longer. Folks call me Dill, said Dill, struggling under the fence. Do better if you go over it instead of under it, I said. Where'd you come from? Dill was from Meridian, Mississippi, was spending the summer with his aunt, Miss Rachel, and would be spending every summer in Macomb from now on. His family was from Macomb County originally. His mother worked for a photographer in Meridian, had entered his picture in a beautiful child contest and won $5. She gave the money to Dill, who went to the picture show 20 times on it. Don't have any picture shows here, except Jesus ones in the courthouse sometimes, said Jim. Ever see anything good? Dill had seen Dracula, a revelation that moved Jim to eye him with the beginning of respect. Tell it to us, he said. Dill was a curiosity. He wore blue linen shorts that buttoned to his shirt. His hair was snow white and stuck to his head like duck fluff. He was a year my senior, but I towered over him. As he told us the old tale, his blue eyes would lighten and darken. His laugh was sudden and happy. He habitually pulled at a cowlick in the center of his forehead. When Dill reduced Dracula to dust and Jim said the show sounded better than the book, I asked Dill where his father was. You ain't said anything about him. I haven't got one. Is he dead? No. Then if he's not dead, you've got one, haven't you? Dill blushed, and Jim told me to hush, a sure sign that Dill had been studied and found acceptable. Thereafter, the summer passed in routine contentment. Routine contentment was improving our treehouse that rested between giant twin chinaberry trees in the backyard, fussing, running through our list of dramas based on the works of Oliver Optic, Victor Appleton, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. In this matter, we were lucky to have Dill. He played the character parts formerly thrust upon me, the ape in Tarzan, Mr. Crabtree in the Rover Boys, Mr. Damon and Tom Swift. Thus we came to know Dill as a pocket Merlin, whose head teemed with eccentric plans, strange longings, and quaint fancies. But by the end of August, our repertoire was vapid from countless reproductions, and it was then that Dill gave us the idea of making Boo Radley come out. All right, so that's our introduction to Dill. So let's jot down some things before we learn more about the Radleys. Okay, so we know a few things about Dill. So as far as his relationship to them, he is going to be one of Scout and Jim's friends. Direct things that we know about him. He is their neighbor, but only during the summer. So he stays with his Aunt Rachel during the summer. Other things we know about him. We got some physical description. He's got white hair. His hair's so blonde it looks white. Blue eyes. He's very, very short, very tiny. So Jim thinks that he's only 4.5 years old, even though Dill, at the start of our book, is 6 years old. So he's about a year older than Scout. Now, other things that we can tell about him from the way that he acts. First thing he says when he sees those kids coming around the side of the yard is, I'm Charles Baker Harris. I can read. So you got to think about, well, what does that say about him? That he's out there like, look at me, look at me, look at what I can do. So one thing we find out about Dill pretty quick is he likes attention. So, look at me, look at what I can do. That's his way of trying to get attention. Another thing that we learn about him, and they kind of mention it when they talk about all their little games that they have over the summer, is he's really creative. So he's kind of a larger-than-life character and plays funny little character parts very, very well. So those are some things we know about Dill so far. We also learned a little bit more about Scout and Jem from the way they interact with Dill, but we'll hold off on that till closer to the end of the chapter. So, okay, let's see. So the Radley place. Boo Radley has been mentioned a few times now. Now I'll go ahead and tell you his first name is not actually Boo. That is a nickname. And the reason for that nickname will be made clear momentarily. But the Radley place is down the street from the Finch family. And curious, attention-loving little Dill is fascinated. The Radley place fascinated Dill. In spite of our warnings and explanations, it drew him as the moon draws water, but drew him no nearer than the light pole on the corner, a safe distance from the Radley gate. There he would stand, his arm around the fat pole, staring and wondering. The Radley place jutted into a sharp curve beyond our house. Walking south, one faced its porch. The sidewalk turned and ran beside the lot. The house was low, was once white with a deep front porch and green shutters, but had long ago darkened to the color of the slate-gray yard around it. Rain-rotted shingles drooped over the eaves of the veranda. Oak trees kept the sun away. The remains of a picket drunkenly guarded the front yard, a swept yard that was never swept, where Johnson grass and rabbit tobacco grew in abundance. Inside the house lived a malevolent phantom. People said he existed, but Jem and I had never seen him. People said he went out at night when the moon was down and peeped in windows. When people's azaleas froze in a cold snap, it was because he had breathed on them. Any stealthy small crimes committed in Maycomb were his work. Once the town was terrorized by a series of morbid nocturnal events. People's chickens and household pets were found mutilated. Although the culprit was Crazy Addie, who eventually drowned himself in Barker's Eddy, people still looked at the Radley place, unwilling to discard their initial suspicions. A Negro would not pass the Radley place at night. He would cut across to the sidewalk opposite and whistle as he walked. The Maycomb school grounds adjoined the back of the Radley lot. From the Radley chicken yard, tall pecan trees shook their fruit into the schoolyard, but the nuts lay untouched by the children. Radley pecans would kill you. A baseball hit into the Radley yard was a lost ball, and no questions asked. The misery of that house began many years before Jem and I were born. The Radleys, welcome anywhere in town, kept to themselves, a predilection unforgivable in Maycomb. They did not go to church, Maycomb's principal recreation, but worshipped at home. Mrs. Radley seldom, if ever, crossed the street for a mid-morning coffee break with her neighbors, and certainly never joined a missionary circle. Mr. Radley walked to town at 11:30 every morning and came back promptly at 12, sometimes carrying a brown paper bag that the neighborhood assumed contained the family groceries. I never knew how old Mr. Radley made his living. Jim said he bought cotton, a polite term for doing nothing, but Mr. Radley and his wife had lived there with their 2 sons as long as anybody could remember. The shutters and doors of the Radley house were closed on Sundays, another thing alien to Macomb's ways. Closed doors meant illness and cold weather only. Of all days, Sunday was the day for formal afternoon visiting. Ladies wore corsets, men wore coats, children wore shoes. But to climb the Radley front steps and call "hey" of a Sunday afternoon was something their neighbors never did. The Radley house had no screen doors. I once asked Atticus if it ever had any. Atticus said yes, but before I was born. According to neighborhood legend, when the younger Radley boy was in his teens, he became acquainted with some of the Cunninghams from Old Sarum, an enormous and confusing tribe domiciled in the northern part of the county, and they formed the nearest thing to a gang ever seen in Maycomb. They did little, but enough to be discussed by the town and publicly warned from 3 pulpits. They hung around the barber shop. They rode the bus to Abbottsville on Sundays and went to the picture show. They attended dances at the county's Riverside Gambling Hell, the Dewdrop Inn and Fishing Camp. They experimented with stump hole whiskey. Nobody in Macomb had nerve enough to tell Mr. Radley that his boy was in with the wrong crowd. All right, so we're getting some initial information on the Radley family, and in particular, Boo Radley. So Boo Radley's actual first name is Arthur Radley. That's his proper birth certificate names. But you can start to see why people call him Boo. There's all these crazy rumors about him. So the reason that Scout and Jim know about him is he is one of their neighbors. So they see him they see his house down the street. They've actually never seen Boo Radley himself. They don't even know what he looks like. So we know that he stays in the house, never comes out. We know, let's see, what else was mentioned so far. Doesn't come out of the house. Ooh, no going to church. That's a strange thing for the town of Macomb. So Boo Radley seems to be kind of a strange character, and there's all these rumors about, oh, well, I bet he was the one that mutilated all those animals and stuff, and he, messed up my flowers, and, all sorts of crazy rumors. So anyways, so that's the Radley family, kind of a strange bunch. Let's see. So when Boo Radley was a boy, he got in with the wrong crowd, the closest thing to a gang ever seen in Macomb. So that's one more thing about him. He was in a gang when he was a kid. Okay, so let's see what the gang got up to. One night, in an excessive spurt of high spirits, the boys backed around the square in a borrowed flivver. A flivver's a car. Resisted arrest by Macomb's ancient beadle, Mr. Connor, and locked him in the courthouse outhouse. The town decided something had to be done. Mr. Connor said he knew who each and every one of them was, and he was bound and determined they wouldn't get away with it. So the boys came before the probate judge on charges of disorderly conduct, disturbing the peace, assault and battery, and using abusive and profane language in the presence and hearing of a female. The judge asked Mr. Connor why he included the last charge. Mr. Connor said they cussed so loud he was sure every lady in Macomb heard them. The judge decided to send the boys to the state industrial school, where boys were sometimes sent for no other reason than to provide them with food and decent shelter. It was no prison and it was no disgrace. Mr. Radley thought it was. If the judge released Arthur, Mr. Radley would see to it that Arthur gave no further trouble. Knowing that Mr. Radley's word was his bond, the judge was glad to do so. The other boys attended the industrial school and received the best secondary education to be had in the state. One of them eventually worked his way through engineering school at Auburn. The doors of the Radley house were closed on weekdays as well as Sundays, and Mr. Radley's boy was not seen again for 15 years. But there came a day, barely within Jim's memory, when Boo Radley was heard from and was seen by several people, but not by Jim. He said Atticus never talked much about the Radleys. When Jim would question him, Atticus's only answer was for him to mind his own business and let the Radleys mind theirs. They had a right to. But when it happened, Jim said Atticus shook his head and said, So Jim received most of his information from Miss Stephanie Crawford, a neighborhood scold, who said she knew the whole thing. According to Miss Stephanie, Boo was sitting in the living room cutting some items from the Macomb Tribune to paste in his scrapbook. His father entered the room. As Mr. Radley passed by, Boo drove the scissors into his parents' leg, pulled them out, wiped them on his pants, and resumed his activities. Mrs. Radley ran screaming into the street that Arthur was killing them all, but when the sheriff arrived, he found Boo still sitting in the living room, cutting up the Tribune. He was 33 years old then. Ooh, okay, so now we really see why Boo Radley is called Boo Radley. Seems kind of a scary fella. So, he got in trouble for being in a gang when he was a kid. Then, his father kept him in the house for 15 years. Now, I know there are some of you who probably felt like, being quarantined for a few months, that was a terrible hardship. Now, imagine 15 years with your parents and there's no internet or television. That's a scary thought. So, seems like Boo Radley might have lost it a little bit because he stabbed his dad in the leg with scissors. Wow. So, a lot of people at this point say, well, obviously, this guy must be crazy. So for now, we let that stand. It doesn't seem like a reasonable, logical, sane person would stab their father in the leg with scissors and then go back to cutting up the paper. So yeah, we'll assume that maybe he's got a screw loose here or there. But hey, I might be crazy after 15 years in the house with my dad, too. Now, some other characters down here who've been mentioned real quick, and I just want to get some facts down for them. Miss Rachel Haverford was mentioned earlier in this section as being Dill's aunt. So just to establish, and she's Scout and Jim's neighbor, so I put neighbor for her there. Another neighbor we've just heard about is Miss Stephanie Crawford. Now, she's described as the neighborhood scold, and that was just an old-fashioned way of saying that she is the town gossip. So she's spreading all this information about Boo Radley. Oh my gosh, did you hear this? Oh my gosh, did you hear that? She's very interested in what's going on there. So, now that we have those facts, all right. The aftermath. So Boo stabbed his father in the leg. Now what happens? Miss Stephanie said old Mr. Radley said no Radley was going to any asylum when it was suggested that a season in Tuscaloosa might be helpful to Boo. Boo wasn't crazy. He was high-strung at times. Psh, it was all right to shut him up, Mr. Radley conceded, but insisted that Boo not be charged with anything. He was not a criminal. The sheriff hadn't the heart to put him in jail alongside Negroes, so Boo was locked in the courthouse basement. Boo's transition from the basement to back home was nebulous in Jim's memory. Miss Stephanie Crawford said some of the town council told Mr. Radley that if he didn't take Boo back, Boo would die of mold from the damp. Besides, Boo could not live forever on the bounty of the county. Nobody knew what form of intimidation Mr. Radley employed to keep Boo out of sight, but Jim figured that Mr. Radley kept him chained to the bed most of the time. Atticus said no, it wasn't that sort of thing, that there were other ways of making people into ghosts. My memory came alive to see Mrs. Radley occasionally open the front door, walk to the edge of the porch, and pour water on her cannas. But every day, Jem and I would see Mr. Radley walking to and from town. He was a thin, leathery man with colorless eyes, so colorless they did not reflect light. His cheekbones were sharp, and his mouth was wide, with a thin upper lip and a full lower lip. Miss Stephanie Crawford said he was so upright, he took the word of God as his only law, and we believed her, because Mr. Radley's posture was ramrod straight. He never spoke to us. When he passed, we would look at the ground and say, "Good morning, sir," and he would cough in reply. Mr. Radley's elder son lived in Pensacola. He came home at Christmas, and he was one of the few persons we ever saw enter or leave the place. From the day Mr. Radley took Arthur home, people said the house died. But there came a day when Atticus told us he'd wear us out if we made any noise in the yard, and commissioned Calpurnia to serve in his absence if she heard a sound out of us. Mr. Radley was dying. He took his time about it. Wooden sawhorses blocked the road at each end of the Radley lot. Straw was put down on the sidewalk. Traffic was diverted to the back street. Dr. Reynolds parked his car in front of our house and walked to the Radleys every time he called. Jem and I crept around the yard for days. At last, the sawhorses were taken away, and we stood watching from the front porch when Mr. Radley made his final journey past our house. "There goes the meanest man ever God blew breath into," murmured Calpurnia, and she spat meditatively into the yard. We looked at her in surprise, for Calpurnia rarely commented on the ways of white people. The neighborhood thought when Mr. Radley went under, Boo would come out, but it had another think coming. Boo's elder brother returned from Pensacola and took Mr. Radley's place. The only difference between him and his father was their ages. Jim said Mr. Nathan Radley bought cotton too. Mr. Nathan would speak to us, however, when we said good morning, and sometimes we saw him coming from town with a magazine in his hand. The more we told Dill about the Radleys, the more he wanted to know. The longer he would stand, hugging the light pole on the corner, the more he would wonder. "Wonder what he does in there," he would murmur. "Looks like he'd just stick his head out the door." Jim said, "He goes out all right when it's pitch dark." Miss Stephanie Crawford said she woke up in the middle of the night one time and saw him looking straight through the window at her. Said his head was like a skull looking at her. "Ain't you ever waked up at night and heard him, Dill? He walks like this." Jim slid his feet through the gravel. "Why do you think Miss Rachel locks up so tight at night? I've seen his tracks in our backyard many a morning, and one night I heard him scratching on the back screen, but he was gone time Atticus got there." "Wonder what he looks like," said Dill. Jim gave a reasonable description of Boo. Boo was about 6.5 feet tall, judging from his tracks. He dined on raw squirrels and any cats he could catch. That's why his hands were bloodstained. If you ate an animal raw, you could never wash the blood off. There was a long, jagged scar that ran across his face. What teeth he had were yellow and rotten. His eyes popped, and he drooled most of the time. "Let's try to make him come out," said Dill. "I'd like to see what he looks like." Jim said if Dill wanted to get himself killed, all he had to do was go up and knock on the front door. All right, so we have some drama developing. The kids are trying to make this crazy old man come out of his house. We have learned some more things about Boo. Now, first off, I should specify that all of these things that Jim is telling us, we have to take with a grain of salt because, of course, Jim has never actually seen Boo Radley. But according to Jim, Boo is 6.5 feet tall. He's got blood-stained hands. He's got a scar on his face. Let's see, there was something else. Oh, he drools. Yeah, that's gross. Very gross. So he's a pretty freaky looking guy for sure. And we're getting the sense that one of the reasons that Dill is so interested in seeing him is because Dill is very, very curious. So that is a factor for sure in all of this. We also learned something else about Calpurnia in this section. It was very brief, but Calpurnia made a comment about Mr. Radley, Boo Radley's father, and said he was the meanest man ever God blew breath into. And Scout, our narrator, said, that was strange because Calpurnia rarely commented on the ways of white people. So we can reasonably assume that Calpurnia is not white. So that gives an extra special meaning to the fact that Atticus always stands up for Calpurnia, always takes her side and defends her when she and Scout have problems. So we're starting to get the sense, based on Atticus' treatment of Calpurnia, that he is a fairly anti-racist individual, and he does not seem to be perhaps as prejudiced and discriminatory as it was typical to be in that time. All right, so there's some things to add. Let's see. Yeah, all right. So let's see how the kids' adventure goes, and then that'll probably be it for chapter 1. All right. So Dill wants to get Boo Radley to come out. How do you get a man who hasn't come out for over 15 years to come out of his house? Our first raid came to pass only because Dill bet Jim, the gray ghost, against 2 Tom Swifts, that Jim wouldn't get any farther than the Radley gate. In all his life, Jim had never declined a dare. Jim thought about it for 3 days. I suppose he loved honor more than his head, for Dill wore him down easily. "You're scared," Dill said the first day. "Ain't scared, just respectful," Jim said. The next day, Dill said, "You're too scared even to put your big toe in the front yard." Jim said he reckoned he wasn't. He'd passed the Radley place every school day of his life. "Always running," I said. But Dill got him the third day, when he told Jim that folks in Meridian certainly weren't as afraid as the folks in Macomb, that he'd never seen such scary folks as the one in Macomb. This was enough to make Jim march to the corner, where he stopped and leaned against the light pole, watching the gate hang crazily on its homemade hinge. "I hope you've got it through your head that he'll kill us, each and every one, Dill Harris," said Jim when we joined him. "Don't blame me when he gouges your eyes out. You started it, remember." "You're still scared," murmured Dill patiently. Jim wanted Dill to know once and for all that he wasn't scared of anything. It's just that I can't think of a way to make him come out without him getting us. Besides, Jim had his little sister to think of. When he said that, I knew he was afraid. Jim had his little sister to think of the time I dared him to jump off the top of the house. If I got killed, what'd become of you? He asked. Then he jumped, landed unhurt, and his sense of responsibility left him until confronted by the Radley place. "You gonna run out on a dare?" asked Dill. "If you are, then—" "Dill, you have to think about these things," Jim said. "Let me think a minute. It's sort of like making a turtle come out." "How's that?" asked Dill. "Strike a match under him." I told Jim if he set fire to the Radley place, I was going to tell Atticus on him. Dill said striking a match under a turtle was hateful. "Ain't hateful, just persuades him. It's not like you chunk him in the fire," Jim growled. "How do you know a match don't hurt him?" "Turtles can't feel, stupid," said Jim. "Were you ever a turtle, huh?" "My stars, Dill. Now let me think. Reckon we can rock him." Jim stood and thought so long that Dill made a mild concession. "I won't say you ran out on a dare, and I'll swap you the gray ghost if you just go up and touch the house." Jim brightened. "Touch the house, that's all?" Dill nodded. "Sure that's all now? I don't want you hollering something different the minute I get back." "Yeah, that's all," said Dill. "He'll probably come out after you when he sees you in the yard. Then Scout and me'll jump on him and hold him down till we can tell him we ain't going to hurt him." We left the corner, crossed the side street that ran in front of the Radley house, and stopped at the gate. So pausing here for a second, what predictions do you make mentally? Will Boo Radley come out and try to kill them? Will the children live through this chapter? We shall see. "Well, go on," said Dill. "Scout and me's right behind you." "I'm going," said Jim. "Don't hurry me." He walked to the corner of the lot, then back again, studying the simple terrain as if deciding how best to effect an entry, frowning and scratching his head. Then I sneered at him. Jim threw open the gate and sped to the side of the house, slapped it with his palm, and ran back past us, not waiting to see if his foray was successful. Dill and I followed on his heels. Safely on our porch, panting and out of breath, we looked back. The old house was the same, droopy and sick. But as we stared down the street, we thought we saw an inside shutter move. Flick. A tiny, almost invisible movement, and the house was still. All right, so attempt to get Boo Radley out, number 1. Not so successful, but somebody is indeed watching. All right, so let's add a few more things to our characters here and fill in some blanks we have. Okay, so now that we've had a whole chapter with Scout and Jim, I want to fill in a little bit of indirect characterization for them. So Scout, we know her age. We also know that she seems to like to play with Jim and Dill. Now, for a little girl in the 1930s, this was maybe a bit strange to have playmates who were boys, who were doing, crazy things like trying to get criminals to come out of their house. So we can probably safely assume that Scout is a little bit of a tomboy, especially with a nickname like Scout. Now, Jim, in the scene where Dill dares him to go up to the house, we can see a little bit of Jim's personality. He's a cautious individual, but he does have a little bit of a sense of adventure, and he seems very susceptible to peer pressure. So Dill really gets under his skin with all those comments that he makes. So we see a lot of Dill's personality there too. All right, who else do we need to add on to? Okay, Miss Rachel and Miss Stephanie. We don't get a lot about them throughout the book, but they're pretty consistent characters in terms of kind of popping up randomly. Now, from what we've seen about Dill, he seems like a bit of a handful. He's curious and he's creative, and that definitely could make him a little bit of a pain to deal with if you were the adult in charge of taking care of him. So the fact that Miss Rachel takes care of Dill every summer, that probably shows us that she is a pretty patient human being, dealing with all of Dill's crazy ideas and his shenanigans. We also know that Miss Stephanie, since she is characterized as being the town gossip, very interested in the information of others, And we can probably pretty safely assume that she's a little bit on the nosy side, likes to get in other people's business. So as you see these characters pop up, just remember those personality traits about them. And I think that is all that we have for today. So that was chapter 1, one of the longest chapters in To Kill a Mockingbird. It will get shorter and more eventful from here.